Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Extraordinary Adventures of Adèle Blanc-Sec from 2010. So this is a movie that I've tripped over a few times. Every once in a while, it just sort of gets mentioned, or somebody mentions a scene from it, or clips it or something like that, and I remember it again. Then I forget about it completely. And the most recent time in the past week that it came across my vision, I decided to check on it again, and it turns out that there are several ways to watch it for free, completely legally, including, well, we'll get into that. I am going to link the way that I ended up watching it, which is on YouTube. And before we get into why that's specifically worth mentioning, this is a French film. It is written and directed by Luc Besson, who I don't remember if I've talked about. I think, I must have talked about him at some point on this series. Who is a writer and director who I have mixed feelings about in general. Most people probably know him primarily from The Fifth Element. That's probably his most well-known film, although more recently he also made Valerian and whatever the extended name of that film is. Luc Besson is an odd person and also an odd filmmaker. And he is very French, but also has a not insubstantial amount of clear Hollywood influence in his filmmaking. He's not making, French New Wave films. He's making French Hollywood films. And that's weird. For a whole bunch of reasons that I can't possibly spend the time to dig into. He also has a particular affinity for comic books and graphic novels and adapting those properties into other things. And Adèle Blanc-Sec this movie is based on a graphic novel series from the 70s that was published in France. And Valerian is also like that, and I think there's some other things in his filmography. I'm trying to remember if Leon the Professional is originally adapted. Anyway, he has a penchant for this sort of thing. And again, while being clearly influenced by Hollywood, his movies are aggressively French, which makes it all the more weird that the first place I found to watch the movie was on Amazon. Except the version on Amazon is in English, and only in English. And the on-screen text, when it is in French, is not subtitled in English, which is a small problem. The bigger problem is the voiceover is awful. Like, truly terrible. Okay, let me back that up a little bit. To whoever is credited with doing both the narrative voiceover and the voices of pretty much all the characters in the first 15 minutes of that film, I don't think that they are voice actor. They are probably professional voice actors. I don't think that they had very much experience with dubbing a film, or at the very least got terrible direction, because every line is said. The recordings themselves are questionable, but the deliveries are without passion and seeming to be without context. It's as if the lines were given to the people to read without them seeing what was going on the screen. They might have like context within the script, but I don't think they could possibly have turned in those performances having seen what was on screen and also be professionals. So watching the first like 10-15 minutes in English before going, hold on, this film is aggressively French. This can't just be Amazon being weird. Why do they not have a French option? Which they don't. It's just not even an option for some reason. So I go looking around. Turns out it's a couple of other places as well, including on YouTube, where you can watch it for free as well. And the version on YouTube is in French, as it should be. However, it is the actual rip of the video itself is notably lower quality. Plus, it's subject to YouTube's compression, which has decreased the quality of the video even further. And it has hard-coded subtitles that you cannot turn off if you only wanted to watch it in French. And even if you do want the subtitles themselves are not very good. They're okay. They're not awful. But I am not fluent in French by any means, but I know enough to get by. And there is a lot of nuance lost in the translations that were done for the subtitling. Now, I feel like I've railed about this before, and I'm going to rail about it again because I will die on this hill, but I'm only going to do it for a moment. Subtitles are not supposed to get the gist of what was said. And this goes two ways. One, it's truly awful when an English language film subtitled in English has cut down subtitles where they have paraphrased what a character said, because the beauty of language, of any language, is not only that you need to hear the specific words that were said, but as a speaker or somebody who comprehends that language, the way you process the specific words has a huge influence on the context and manner in which sentences are constructed has a huge effect on their functional meaning in the language. Changing a few words may not seem like a big deal if you get the gist of it, but it can tonally completely shift a scene. So don't do that. Becomes a different but similar related problem when you are translating from another language. Because yes, there are plenty of phrases in plenty of languages, and even just straight words, that have no proper translation, that you just kind of have to do your best to phrase properly. But whoever was doing these translations, even I, as somebody who doesn't really speak French, caught enough phrases and just completely like jokes that are just skipped over completely, and tonally functionally different words where they just picked something that was vaguely correct, and technically it's not wrong in the sense that you still know the basic meaning of what they said, but the meaning, the real meaning, the true meaning of what was said and the nuance in the language completely lost. Okay, I'm going to pull that back, because I'm sure you'll hear that from me some other time about some other movie. So how do we talk about this film? Well, this film is a weird amalgamation of different things that don't entirely work together. And the longer I watched this film, the more I was sort of not very happy with how it was going. It starts off reasonably strong with a setting and a set of like initial scenes that give you some sort of intrigue and mystery that you want to see explored and explained. And then for about 2/3 of the film, the movie mostly just meanders around and does things and has scenes that do address the plot. They are not completely without context, but in the overarching story don't have that much direct influence and are mostly there because they are amusing scenes to have. And don't get me wrong, some of those scenes are actually really good, but they could be completely excised from the film and they would lose nothing. That also leads to a confusion problem where it's hard to tell what the movie is really the story the movie is really trying to tell. Is this there are about 5 different plot through lines that follow to the end, and most of them conclude at the end of that sort of 2/3, 3/4 mark. Weirdly, that's also the 2/3 to 3/4 mark. The ending sort of the ending third is really, I think, where the movie shines the best, and really makes me wish that even like most of the plot threads in the majority of the film had been removed completely and instead followed this particular thread, which is introduced at the beginning and is basically the only remaining one right up at the very end of the film. So it ends up just being sort of muddled and confused, and does some interesting things in between, but there are so many characters, so many plot lines, and so many tonally different beats that are interwoven with each other that it starts to become a little bit tiring to try and track how we're supposed to feel for a particular scene. This also, I feel like I have to mention, because this is a particularly French film, and French films often, I'm not going to say generally, because I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but especially more popular pop culture French films tend to have how do I put this? Imperial revisionism to them, and especially ones that are period pieces, which this is. This is sort of turn of the 20th century era, and that sort of does permeate throughout the entire film. Now, I've never read the comic this is based on. I don't even know if it's translated to English. I was skimming some information about it, and from the sounds of it, a big part of the reason it existed in the first place was that Adèle was supposed to be a character who sort of hit a middle ground or a different path than two very important characters in French comic history. One of them, whose name is completely escaping me. She's the sort of nanny maid character who it's going to kill me. I'm not French. If the French will kill me for this, for not knowing it. And the other one being Barbarella, which everybody's sort of vaguely aware of Barbarella, because it goes from the incredibly sort of chaste and prudish maid character who's very wholesome to, the past the satire of a liberated sexual woman on the other end. And Adèle was supposed to be sort of a character to hit a middle ground of somebody who was sort of extraordinary for being somewhat liberated, especially in a time when women were not particularly liberated. This is all particularly relevant because I think this movie suffers from a thing a lot of French movies suffer from, and a lot of Luc Besson movies suffer from, which is both a sort of imperialist view of the rest of the world relative to France, as well as a somewhat misogynistic, not so far out of cultural norm, I would say, This came out in 2010. No, it's not it's not great, even for the French. There's a trend of a particularly misogynistic view of women and a very male gaze framing of a lot of elements. Even when the text of the film tells you that you're supposed to be, enjoying this character for her non-sexual, non-womanly features, for being a good character rather than the function of being, a sexual object, the framing of the film ends up telling you otherwise. I'm not going to go too far on a diatribe on that. It's just in the background and it's not ideal. So meandering back to the actual composition of the film, Luc Besson has what I would say is a relatively visually appealing style, and one that is usually the thing that keeps me coming back to see things that he has produced or directed. He does unique things with the camera and with the effects, and he produces unique looking films, and it is harder to tie them down to our particular cinematic style, or to pinpoint specific things. It's more a fantastical sense that everything's a little bit heightened. And I think this is very visible in something like Fifth Element. It's also visible in things like Valerian and other things that he's produced as well. Even Leon has a sort of an over-the-top aspect to it, even when it's relatively subtle. I don't want to call Leon subtle, but it is subtle in some ways. And that is very much on display here. The problem is that not all the effects work great, especially the CG. There's some CG that is used for the first 2/3 of the film that frankly looks terrible. And it's really key to the film. It's not I'll just say it because it may or may not be on the post. It is on some of the posters, and it may or may not be on the poster I put on this video. It's the pterodactyl. The pterodactyl looks like shit. And that's a shame, because it's not like this movie is visually incapable or was incapable of producing decent computer-generated visual effects. In fact, the last third of the film has a whole bunch of CGI in it that works really, really well. Does it look like mind-blowing? No, but it is functionally very good. And you can get away with a lot of stylistic choices in a visual effect if you have, you can get away with it not looking quite right if it's stylistically appropriate. And for the thing that I won't spoil in the last third of the film, it looks very appropriate and works really well. So in addition to the story tightening up, the visuals looking better, the characters having more sort of well-rounded development and coming to a meaningful conclusion, the last third of the film is so much better than the rest of it that I'm trying not to look at the rest of it with rose-tinted glasses. There's also the question of who this is really for, because I can't particularly tell. Now, again, this is something that the first 2/3 suffers from a lot, and the last third not so much. This is not, I don't think, a particularly appropriate film for kids. I think you could take a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old to this and probably have no issues, although if they're not French, they're not going to read the subtitles, so it's a moot point. You could take a kid to see this. And a lot of the plot beats, especially in those first 2/3, are sort of tailored towards what I would call more child-targeted structuring, of being more there for their visual appeal and their humor than for being functionally necessary and important towards furthering the plot. They're there to fill time feels judgmental, but they are there more for the sake of being there as a small vignette than they are for the film as a whole. And this is where I start drawing some comparisons to a couple of films we've watched. In particular, one being Tintin, which suffers from a whole bunch of similar things, like I mentioned before. And now suddenly the other one has escaped me. The other one being Enola Holmes, which is, again, suffers from a lot of the similar things, where it's not quite sure what it's the framing is not quite what you expect. The tone is not quite appropriate for kids, but not really targeted adults either all the time. It's really sort of a mixed. It's a very weird mixed situation that's going on there. So ultimately, what does this come down to? It comes down to a sort of goofy fantasy movie with a lot of structural problems, and a vision that doesn't execute quite the way it alleges it's going to at the beginning of the film. And if you're into if you're really like The Fifth Element, if you really like a sort of a fantastical story kind of thing, I think this is actually pretty good for all my complaints with it. But it does have a lot of problems. There are a bunch more that I haven't even touched on, but I'm not going to because I'm just going to be nitpicking all day. It's a weird one, but it's interesting. It doesn't drag too much, even though it's not crazy short. Actually, I think the version on YouTube that I watched is the director's cut, which is a few minutes longer. That's neither here nor there. It's free. If it's free to watch, if it's thematically up your alley, it's interesting enough and executed well enough, and you could do worse with your time. But it's more interesting for me as an analysis of all its things that it doesn't quite do than it does. Really, the standout features for me are some of the humor, some of the writing is actually quite good. And aside from that, a lot of it's kind of okay. Anyway, I'm going to stop rambling about this too much because I could continue. But anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.